Welcome to Chain Reaction, the Foreign Policy Research Institute's flagship network of podcast series examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Join us each month for
Bear Market Brief,
Baltic Ways,
Report in Short,
The Continent,
and of course, our flagship, Chain Reaction. New episodes are available each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This week on Chain Reaction.
As the war in Ukraine approaches its second anniversary, it presents a far different picture than it did a year ago. After successful Ukrainian counteroffensives in summer and fall 2022, Ukraine's position in February 2023 looked favorable, and hopes were high for Kyiv's planned counteroffensive that summer. The failure of that counteroffensive to deliver major territorial gains, the interruption of U.S. support, and Russia's continued relentless attacks have caused many to wonder how the war might end. Here with me on Chain Reaction today to discuss the likely trajectory of the war, the future of U.S. support for Ukraine, and the future role of the U.S. in NATO is Dr. Stephen Biddle. Stephen Biddle is Professor of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University and an Adjunct Senior Fellow for Defense Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. He has served on the Defense Department's Defense Policy Board, on General David Petraeus' Joint Strategic Assessment Team in Baghdad in 2007, and as a senior advisor to the Central Command Assessment Team in Washington from 2008 to 2009, as a member of General Stanley McChrystal's initial Strategic Assessment Team in Kabul in 2009, and on a variety of other government advisory panels and analytical teams. He lectures regularly at the U.S. Army War College and other military schools, and has presented testimony before congressional committees on issues relating to the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, force planning, conventional net assessment, and European arms control. So, Steve, thanks for joining me today on Chain Reaction.
Thanks for having me.
So we're here to talk about Ukraine and a couple of themes, but first specifically Ukraine and I guess what we would call offensive warfare or offensive maneuver. So why did Ukraine's offensive succeed in 2022, but appears not to have succeeded in 2023?
Yeah, I think there were permissive conditions in 2022 that there have not been in 2023. And I think about a century of military experience, this sort of thing has demonstrated that with permissive conditions, offensive maneuver has been possible in the past and remains so today. But without them, it's been very hard for a century. So in 2022, at Kharkiv, the Ukrainians struck an overextended, shallow Russian defense that was poorly prepared and had very little, if anything, in the way of reserves behind it. In the Kyiv counteroffensive, they were striking a Russian force that had not had a chance to prepare for defense at all and was still expecting to advance and take Kyiv. And so again, they were striking defenses that weren't organized or prepared or disposed for effective defense. Kherson, by contrast, they were striking better prepared, better dug in positions, but that were stranded on the wrong side of the Dnipro River. And as a result, had massive logistical problems. There were only a handful of bridges across the river that could support meaningful military logistics traffic. The Ukrainians could strike those bridges. They were able to grind down Russian sustainability on the west side of the Dnipro River to the point where eventually they could essentially force them into a withdrawal across the river. In each of these three cases, the Ukrainians in 2022 were not striking the kind of defense that they found themselves confronting in summer of 2023. Deep, well-prepared, fronted with mines, backed by reserves, well-sustained logistically, and garrisoned by troops who fought when attacked. That's been a tough recipe for offensive maneuver for a very long time. And unsurprisingly, it wasn't an easy problem for the Ukrainians in the summer of 2023 either.
Yeah, so you hear many different explanations for the failure of the 2023 counteroffensive, right? You'll hear that, well, the Ukrainians made some mistakes, right? Tactically and operationally. You'll hear, hey, they went into a counteroffensive in a way no Western army ever would, and they did it without command of the air, right? Because the Western equipment that had been promised had not arrived by the time they undertook the offensive. You'll hear people say, well, they didn't really designate a main effort. They attacked along, they sort of dispersed their forces along a long front instead of attacking in a couple of key areas. What do you make of those arguments? Any of them make sense?
Well, I mean, I think some of them make more sense than others. I think in general in land warfare, outcomes are more sensitive to variations in how forces are used than to the equipment that forces have available to them. So some of the explanations in the debate and that you so adeptly summarized a moment ago tend to emphasize equipment issues. They didn't have F-16s. They didn't have other air assets that could have enabled air superiority. People have also argued that if they had just had ATACMS missiles, then they could have prevailed, or if they had just had a large fleet of Abrams tanks, then they could have prevailed. I think these kinds of technology materiel explanations are among the weaker ones. Addressing a couple of them briefly by way of suggesting why I think they're weak. The F-16 is, an ancient platform. It's been around for more than 40 years. It's being retired from Western air forces and replaced by the F-35 precisely because it's believed to be too vulnerable to modern air defenses. It would be extremely vulnerable to the kind of air defense environment that we see in Ukraine at the moment. It's very hard to believe that a fleet of F-16s, upgrade though they would be to the Ukrainians' even older MiG-29s, would somehow create air superiority for them. I find that not terribly persuasive. ATACMS missiles, the HIMARS missiles that we provided to Ukraine in 2022 were initially very effective, but then the Russians adapted to them. They dispersed their forces, they moved their log bases deeper to get them out of reach, but they also learned how to jam and spoof the GPS signals that both HIMARS and ATACMS use for guidance. Right, so I think it's unlikely that an adaptive opponent, which Russia is now, would somehow or another just be obliterated by the provision of a longer range missile. Abrams tanks. Right? The Abrams is a wonderful tank, quite plausibly the best tank in the world at the moment. I'm sure they would have been better off if they had had them, as they would have been better off if they'd had ATACMS, and as they would have been better off if they'd had F-16s, but not so much better off that it's likely to have made the difference between stalemate and breakthrough. So the Ukrainians had something on the order of 100 German Leopard 2s available to them in this offensive. The Leopard 2 is a comparable tank to the M1, maybe a little better in some respects, a little worse in other respects, but mostly very similar and radically superior to the T-64s and T-72s that the Ukrainians had, and the T-72-80s and 90s that the Russians had. And they used them in the beginning of the offensive, and unsurprisingly, they suffered casualties. Something north of a fourth of the Ukrainian fleet of Leopard 2s have been knocked out since the beginning of the summer counteroffensive. I mean, no tank is a silver bullet wonder weapon that can operate unsupported by combined arms and appropriate logistical sustainment, neither of which the Ukrainians could provide in the summer of 2023. And therefore, there was no evidence that their progress rate correlated at all with the presence or absence of the Leopard 2s that were available. Therefore, it's hard to see how Abramses in large numbers would have made a difference if they'd been employed the way the Ukrainians employed the Leopard 2s, which brings us to the other class of explanations you cited, which I think have more face validity to them. The differences in how Ukraine used what they had might have had greater leverage on the outcome than different kinds of things they could have had. And in general, I tend to think that this sort of explanation can have some purchase. And clearly, the Ukrainians did a variety of things that certainly I don't think were optimal for them. And my impression is that the U.S. military doesn't think were optimal to them. splitting their focus among three axes of advance when they barely had enough resources to do one right. Not good. Great difficulties in combining arms at scale, great difficulties in synchronizing various elements of combat power, very limited training for the brigades that led the offensive. They got, everyone talks about the Western training they got. 5 weeks, right, isn't remotely enough to master the complexity of modern warfare. So I'm persuaded that in terms of marginal effect on the outcome, you would probably have gotten a bigger effect on the outcome with different force employment than with different equipment. The issue here is the implication that is often kind of sotto voce in this argument, that if only they had done what we wanted them to do, if only they had focused on one axis of advance, if only they had trained their forces better, if only they'd combined arms and so on and so on, then they would have broken through. They'd be on the Black Sea. The land bridge to Crimea would be cut and the war would be radically different. And I'm not sure I buy that part. It has been very hard for even very proficient militaries to break through defenses of the kind that the Russians were deploying in the summer of 2023. Right, the Germans in World War II are often considered to be among the most proficient militaries of the modern era, at least at the tactical and operational level. And yet they failed against these kinds of defenses at Kursk in 1943. Erwin Rommel, the famous Desert Fox, failed against these kinds of defenses at Tobruk in 1941 with air superiority. He failed against these kinds of defenses at Alam al-Halfa in 1942. The Western allies failed even with massive air supremacy against these kinds of defenses at Operation Goodwood, Operation Epsom, Operation Market Garden, the Siegfried Line, Monte Cassino. There's a long list of people who've tried to do this, some with air superiority, some not, some extremely proficient at the tactical level, some less. It's just been very hard for anyone to do. Now, it's a counterfactual that we can't fully resolve, whether the U.S. military would have succeeded in the summer of 2023 against the kind of defense the Russians were mounting. The Russian defenders in 2023 were not the Wehrmacht of 1944. Right? They had the basics right. They fought when attacked. They were well disposed, well prepared, but still they were not the Wehrmacht. But it requires a big skill differential to breach cleanly these kinds of defenses. Would have been a better bet to speculate that perhaps the U.S. military would have had a skill differential sufficient to overcome the intrinsic strengths of these kinds of defensive dispositions. But there's very little historical evidence to suggest that would have been an easy project. And I could imagine it going either way, even with the U.S. military, much less the Ukrainians.
So let me ask you a more general question, and that is, what are we learning from the war in Ukraine? You'll hear people say that, people who study warfare talk a lot about the offense-defense balance. And in some phases of warfare, historically, the offense has ascended. Some combination of tactics and technology makes offensive maneuver the dominant form of warfare. And then there are other times when the defense is dominant. So you'll hear people talk about Ukraine and say the combination of persistent surveillance, usually enabled by drones, and long-range precision fires or strike capability has made offensive maneuver really, really difficult in this war. So do you buy that? And if so, are we seeing a change in the character of war? And what may break the ascendancy of the defense? What will it take to make offensive maneuver more tenable?
Yeah, I actually don't think defense is ascendant today in any way that it hasn't been for the last 100 years. I mean, warfare always changes, so certainly it's changing now, right? The drones, satellite surveillance, precision weapons, these are all new challenges that require new adaptations by militaries to respond to. But the usual lesson that people are drawing incorrectly, in my view, from this war is that war was offense dominant for gosh knows how long. And then, lo and behold, you get this new gear. You get drones, you get satellites, you get javelins and other kinds of precision weaponry. And now, oh my gosh, war is defense dominant, offensive maneuver is impossible. Everything has changed. I think that's a misunderstanding of both the past and the present. Right? The past shows plenty of defensive stalemates against these kinds of defenses, but plenty of offensive breakthroughs when conditions are permissive. Defenses are shallow, they don't have reserves, they aren't properly prepared, they're not logistically supported, the defenders don't fight, and so on. Today, you see the same thing, right? The same satellite surveillance that people talk about now was available at the Kharkiv counteroffensive, the Kyiv counteroffensive, and the Kherson counteroffensive, all of which succeeded militarily just a year ago. Precision weapons were available, drones were available, right? These new technologies have not created some uniform condition of defense dominance in which offensive maneuver has been impossible. Under basically the same technological era, we've seen offensive breakthroughs and offensive failures and stalemates in Ukraine, right? And we saw offensive breakthroughs and defensive stalemates with tanks, airplanes, and radios in World War II, right? And with early precision weapons in 1973 or in 1991. There's this whole idea that technology creates these systemic, unbreakable conditions of dominance for the offense or dominance for the defense. I think is a misunderstanding of the role technology plays in war. Right? It's obviously an important feature in war, but the best way to understand its function is not that it creates these kinds of successive waves of offenses dominant or offenses impossible, but that what it does is, as weapons have gotten more lethal over time, the failure to defend in the way we've been talking about gets increasingly painful for defenders. The failure to use combined arms, covering concealment, fire, and maneuver on the offense gets more painful for attackers. But the point of most great power systems of force employment since around 1917 has been to use the complexity of the Earth's surface to reduce your exposure to increasingly lethal weapons. And when you do that, increasingly lethal weapons have much, much less real battlefield effect. When you don't, increasingly lethal weapons get increasingly painful. They also establish requirements for adaptation of various kinds of change over time. Technology does matter, but the way it matters is to create an increasing delta between the real military performance of military organizations who can do combined arms, who can do cover and concealment, who can do fire and maneuver, who can do defensive depth, and the ones who cannot. Not to just periodically swap offense dominance for defense dominance in some systemic global sort of way. I don't think that's an accurate characterization of a century of military experience.
Yeah, so is it fair to say that, yes, there are some structural conditions at play here, but then there's also the skill of the commander, the level of training of the forces, the ability to do real combined arms and even joint operations can break those structural conditions or can mitigate against conditions that either make offense or defense easier or harder?
Absolutely. I mean, real combat outcomes are a product of an interaction between the nature of the material and how it's used. If you've only got to look at one of them, how it's used will usually get you better mileage. But if you really want to understand the variance we observe, you have to look at how these two things interact. And the problem with the debate is usually that it looks almost exclusively at the technology. We tend to be materialists. We're fascinated with stuff. But if you look only at the stuff, right, I think you risk serious error.
Yeah. Let me ask you this: so what breaks the stalemate? How does this, if we agree that what we're seeing in Ukraine right now is General Zaluzhny called a positional war when he was the chief of defense of Ukraine, how do you break that?
Yeah, Zaluzhny, prior to his defenestration, characterized the war as a stalemate, but said it could be broken by new technology. I'm with him on the first part, but not so much on the second. Right? I don't think technology created the condition of stalemate in the summer of 2023, and I don't think technology is going to uncreate it. I think that the easiest way to break the stalemate, I regret to say, is a Western aid cutoff to the Ukrainians. Right? I mean, modern warfare is capital intensive. It does consume ammunition, fuel, other supplies at a ferocious rate. Even a well-designed deep defense fronted by mines, backed by reserves, still needs ammunition. Mm-hmm. And it still needs fuel. And it still needs spare parts for the armored vehicles and other equipment. If Western aid stops, then it will be costly for the Russians, but they will take ground if the aid halt lasts long enough and extends far enough deep into Europe as well as the United States. Then Ukraine will eventually lose the ability to hold a viable front. So that's one way in which the stalemate could end. I hope it's not the way. Mm-hmm. Another way in which the stalemate could end is cumulative attrition could leave one or both sides unable to populate well-designed defenses. So force to space ratios, as they're sometimes called, do matter. And it's generally believed that the lower the force to space ratio, the relationship between the number of combatants and the area that they are occupying, gets lower. Offense, other things being equal, gets easier. I mean, a common argument about the Kharkiv counteroffensive in 2022 was that the Russian frontal assaults that had preceded it had thinned their own forces to the point where they could not provide a deep defense at Kharkiv backed by reserves and all the rest. You could imagine that as the manpower sources deplete in Russia and or Ukraine, that they could eventually get to the point, not soon, but eventually, where they're unable to populate their defenses correctly. That could lead to the kinds of permissive conditions I was talking about earlier. Probably what breaks the stalemate is a change in public support for the war in either Russia or Ukraine. That looks pretty distant at the moment, but it's plausible that eventually public support could decay to the point where both sides decide they need to settle the war, at which point the stalemate ends because the war ends. The polling I've seen for Ukraine has suggested that whereas through all of 2022 and the first half of 2023, something in the order of middle 80% of Ukrainians polled had opposed any territorial concessions at all to settle the war. That figure is now down to the mid 70s, largely as a result of frustration with the the summer offensive in 2023. If that downward trend continues, eventually you could imagine popular support for the war in Ukraine decaying to the point where some kind of settlement to end the conflict becomes viable in a way that it is not now. That would also, of course, end the stalemate.
Do you see any way that either side can achieve its war aims through purely military means? Is outright military victory possible for either side?
I don't think it is. And I don't think it ever is, actually. I think in many respects, the notion of military victory is a misleading one. In the case of Ukraine, when people argue for military victory, that rarely do they define it very carefully, but usually they're implying that means something like empower Ukraine militarily to retake every last square millimeter of its territory, either as of the territory they held on February 1st, 2022, or the territory they held in 2014, but allow Ukraine to retake all of Ukraine. The trouble is that doesn't stop the fighting, right? That doesn't prevent Putin from continuing to launch airstrikes against Kyiv, Odessa, other Ukrainian cities from air bases deep in Russia that it's inconceivable that Ukraine is simply going to annihilate. Ukraine cannot destroy Russia's defense industrial base. Ukraine cannot destroy Russia's mobilization potential. Ukraine can't annihilate the Russian military in the field. If Ukraine cannot destroy Russia's ability to make war, and of course they can't, then if Putin chooses to, he can keep shooting as long as he wants to. He's been waging a major strategic bombing campaign against Kyiv and other cities for 12 months now, off and on. It would be straightforward for him to simply continue the same thing. Moreover, if he were to respond to Ukraine's retaking Ukrainian territory by saying to the Russian people, sorry about that, my bad. I started a voluntary war that wasn't necessary, killed who knows how many tens to hundreds of thousands of our citizens, burned up vast quantities of capital. Never mind. We lose. I guess they win. Right. That's a recipe for a coup d'etat. And all Putin has to do to avoid that scenario and to avoid handing, casus belli for a coup to his domestic opponents is simply say the war isn't over. We've suffered some momentary reverses. But that's because we're fighting the whole West, right? We're at war against the United States. We've seen this before. This is what happened to us in World War II, and we came back. And just as we did in World War II, we will come back again. And so the war grinds on. And you don't get military victory with the central intuitive component of an end to the war. All you get is holding some more ground while the war grinds on. But in fact, this is not a problem that's unique to Ukraine. It's practically impossible for any power, Ukraine, the United States, Russia, the Soviet Union, anyone else, to end wars by military fiat, right? By destroying the enemy's capacity to resist and imposing an unconditional surrender. The last example of that I know of offhand is the end of the Third Punic War, right, in the 2nd century BC, in which Rome destroyed Carthage, killed every member of the Carthaginian military, sold the surviving women and children into slavery, flattened the city, and sprinkled salt over the ruins so nothing would ever grow again. That's military victory, right? That rendered Carthage physically incapable of continuing to resist. Since then, nobody ever does that. Right? I mean, it didn't happen in World War II. It didn't happen to Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan. Nazi Germany mobilized something on the order of 15 million soldiers in the course of World War II. Fewer than a third of them were ever killed, wounded, or captured. They still had millions of soldiers uniformed, equipped, armed, in their formations, under their leaders, in the field, in a position to continue resisting, when instead they decided to surrender. They inflicted 360,000 casualties on the Russians in the Battle of Berlin just a few weeks before they surrendered. They were not destroyed militarily. They chose to stand down in a tacit settlement in which they decided the terms that were being offered to them, which, by the way, were not unconditional surrender. We offered them explicit conditions to stand down, looked better to them than continuing to fight, but they could have continued to fight, and the Allied High Command expected them to. We were desperately worried that they were going to melt into the Black Forest and continue to resist as guerrillas, as, for example, the Baathists did in 2003, or the Taliban did in 2001. Japanese fielded about 10 million combatants in World War II. Fewer than half of them were ever killed or wounded in the course of the war. The expectation in the War Department in 1945 was that Operation Downfall, the coming expected invasion of the Japanese home islands, was going to have the Japanese inflicting something on the order of 800,000 or more casualties on the U.S. invasion force. They were obviously not destroyed militarily. They, too, had the ability to resist. The terms we were offering them got softer and easier over the course of 1945, and then there were the atom bombings. The combination of the expectation of more atom bombings and the fact that the Potsdam Declaration was explicitly silent on the status of the emperor caused the Japanese to decide to stop shooting when they could have otherwise. Putin's situation in Ukraine is radically less unfavorable than Tokyo or Berlin, and neither of them were destroyed militarily. So surely Putin's forces aren't. The war in Ukraine, like all other wars, is eventually going to have to end in some kind of settlement. Maybe very one-sided, maybe not, but it's not going to win because Ukraine somehow or another imposes victory on an unwilling Russia who chooses not to accept.
And you see the inverse of that is also true, that Russia will be, even if it controls all of Ukraine, the war won't be over. Ukraine can continue to fight.
Exactly. I mean, Vlad, right? Take a memo from George W. Bush. Right? I mean, we destroyed the Iraqi military in 2003 way more thoroughly than we destroyed the German military in 1945. The Coalition Provisional Authority couldn't find Iraqi soldiers to pay. They disappeared. They vanished into the countryside. There was no Iraqi military, and that didn't end the war. The Taliban military were evicted from Afghanistan in 2001. That did not end the war. If the other side hasn't decided they would rather stop because they prefer the terms on offer to continue fighting, fighting continues. It just may use different methods. What some prefer to call guerrilla or regular techniques, and in a recent book I've called Fabian force employment policies. If the other side has not decided they want to stop, and you haven't annihilated them in a Carthaginian solution, which no one ever does, then the war will just continue. It will simply be an insurgency rather than conventional, but that doesn't mean that the fighting ends, as Americans of all people should know.
Yeah, yes, we should. So, Steve, this has been sobering but fascinating for me to get your thoughts on both the Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023. It's been the subject of a lot of discussion, and then more generally, just how do wars end, right? And whether either side can win militarily. You've given us a lot to think about. Let me ask you one last thing, and that is Western support. It's sort of the elephant in the room. Here we are in February 2024, there's a $60 billion Ukraine supplemental that looks like it might get through the Senate, and who knows if it'll get through the House. What do you see as the on the horizon in terms of Western support for Ukraine, U.S. support, and what difference might that make?
Yeah, I think especially for the U.S., this depends centrally on the November elections. The Republican Party as currently constituted is, I think, very unlikely to sustain aid to Ukraine. It's not because the majority of Republican lawmakers oppose it. On the contrary, I mean, I'm convinced that the vast majority of them want to do it. The trouble is the base of the Republican Party is populist and Trumpist, and Trump has very clearly turned against this war, and the base is with him on it. And as a result, it's politically perilous for Republicans to support the war. And as a result, Republican elected official support for the war has been plummeting for the last year. I think as a general rule, no one has gone broke in the American politics prediction market by betting that whatever Donald Trump says today is going to be the view of the majority of the party in 6 months. And Trump is clearly very hostile to supporting Ukraine. I don't think the Republican Party, as currently constituted, is ever going to be able to pass Ukraine aid. In November, things might change, but I'm very pessimistic given the current state of American domestic politics. I regret to say, as someone who has supported aid to Ukraine throughout the conflict, but I very much doubt that my Republican elected friends are going to be able to sustain that position.
So you see continued aid before, at least until November, you see it as pretty unlikely that certainly the $60 billion supplemental or anything significant gets through Congress and makes it to Ukraine?
I would be delighted if it did, but I'd be surprised.
Let me ask you one more question. You said whatever comes out of Donald Trump's mouth today is likely to be sort of the Republican majority opinion in 6 months. Wasn't today, but very recently, he made the remark about NATO, and that is that countries that haven't paid, that he would tell Russia to do whatever the hell it wants to them. So what do you think the effects of this are going to be? Is this just a one-off and off-the-cuff statement, which he sometimes does, or is he telling us what he actually thinks, and is he likely to be able to bring the Republican Party and a national security establishment of a potential future Trump administration into line with that thinking?
I don't think this is new with Donald Trump, right? He has not been a friend of NATO for a very long time. And he has long viewed NATO as kind of a golf club, right? Where you pay dues to the management and then you get to play golf, right? That obviously is not the way NATO actually functions, but Donald Trump has his own peculiar views of this. Just as an aside, the irony of Donald Trump, famous in the New York real estate industry for a guy who stiffs his contractors, is now trying to encourage Russia to invade Western allies that he says are stiffing us, even when they're not. Right? It's just there's certain weird bits of intellectual jujitsu involved in that. All that having been said, right, for populist right-wing Americans, NATO is a very hard sell, and it is an increasingly hard sell. It's a group of foreigners who are viewed as elitist and looking down on Americans and are darlings of globalists who have sold out American workers for international trade deals and foreign production. Right? It is not hard to tar NATO to populist, working class, right wing Americans. Right? The argument one often hears from that school is the monumental unfairness of they've got universal health care, we don't, we're paying their bills. So goes this argument. Right? I mean, I don't buy this argument. It ignores massive amounts of what the Europeans are doing. It ignores, for example, the lives that Europeans sacrificed shoulder to shoulder with us in places like Afghanistan. This is not an argument that's intellectually sustainable, but it's an argument that's easy to sell for a very critical part of the Republican domestic political constituency. And I think Donald Trump has discovered that NATO is easy to pillory to people he views as his base. Support for NATO is associated with Democrats. That's easy to attack. And moreover, the Ukrainians, of all people, didn't help him out against Joe Biden prior to the 2020 election. So I don't think he harbors any particular fondness for them. You combine all of this, and I think NATO is a big, fat, low-hanging target for Donald Trump and populist Republicans. If I were in a European capital, I'd be working very hard to rationalize defense spending within NATO Europe and prepare for the possibility that the United States might not be there for them anymore if Republicans win in November.
Well, okay, we'll end on that very sobering note. So, Steve, again, thank you so much for taking the time to share your insights on not only Ukraine, but Western aid to Ukraine, the future of NATO, and a lot of other really important, really complicated, and sobering topics.
My pleasure. I wish I had a more uplifting message, but I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.
It's going to be an interesting year, 2024. Thank you, Steve. Thanks for tuning in to Chain Reaction, a podcast of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Note that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of FPRI. I'm your host, Dr. Bob Hamilton, Head of Eurasia Research at FPRI. Visit us at fpri.org for more on today's topic and many others in the world of foreign policy and national security. Thanks for listening. See you soon.